Welcome to the Palm Court Podcast. Mike Palmer here, joined as always by Grant Balfour. And we're back. Grant, how are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited. We have a really interesting guest who we should introduce to our audience. Jono Miller is here with us today. Jono, welcome to the Palm Court Podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's great to have you. As I was catching you up at the top, we've been having a bunch of conversations lately about the Lorax Rebellion back in 1988, right before I got to New College.
Mm-hmm.
We always like to start with folks' origin story. You're about as close to a New College superhero as is out there. So, like, if we could hear maybe your history and how it connects.
Yeah, I don't know about
college.
superhero, but I have been it's now closing in on 54 years with some relationship with the college.
That's amazing. Yeah. And that dates back to, I guess, 1970 then.
Right. I arrived in 1970. One of my first classes was wading out to Sarasota Bay with John Morrill and connected to the campus landscape since then.
We've been talking about how this podcast it's kind of an exploration of memory. When you said John Morrill going out into the Bay, I immediately thought Speedo. And I don't know if that's just because my head goes in the wrong direction, but is that that's potentially accurate memory?
That was my first semester in 1986. Morrill wading out into the Bay.
Nice.
Don't ask, where were you arriving from? I was arriving from the other side of Florida, so it was like, oh, no big deal.
I had been in a prep school in Princeton, New Jersey, a boarding school.
Oh, wow.
That ain't the same landscape.
I was pretty familiar with the eastern deciduous forest and the barrier islands of New Jersey and Massachusetts.
Yeah, Central Jersey's nice.
Florida. I'd only been to Florida once before when I was 13, when we visited an island in the Keys that a friend of my father's owned.
Wow. And then at the same time, somehow you discovered New College.
It was a day school prior to the boarding school, and we were told to go to the library and look at college catalogs, and somebody pulled this little paperback book off the shelf and said, look, here's a good college in Florida. And we all laughed and punched each other in the shoulder and said, yeah, right. But I looked at it, and then subsequently, I guess I did fairly well on the National Merit Test. When I got promotional material from the college, I'd already heard about it. And it appealed to me because at that point, I'd taken enough tests and sat in enough classes and gotten enough grades that I really didn't want to do that much anymore.
Yeah, I imagine. I mean, I grew up in kind of competitive Long Island public school, and it was the same. It was like Hunger Games of academic sorting, and you try to do as well as you can. And, New College, even that was later, 88, I got there. But like by that point, it was an alternative model in the 80s. And I think even, you're talking 1970, that's not too far after the charter class. And this is also while it was still private.
Right. A number of charter class people were still around. David Pena was around, but there were a number of other people that either had graduated and were still in town, or people that had come in, not the first class, but in the charter, the first three classes, people were still around. So yeah, I had connections with a number of them, and they were gracious enough to invite Julie and I to their 60th reunion a couple of weeks ago. And so it was great to reconnect with some of them.
And Julie is your wife?
Yes, Julie Morris. And I'm her husband.
It's good when it works that way. Reciprocity is the key to a happy marriage.
The use of the possessive in those is always a little awkward.
Oh my God. Don't get me started. But then you met at New College?
We met in the same orientation class.
Oh, wow.
Orientation group. And we took the same class with John Morrill.
Oh, wow.
Swimsuits right away.
Yeah, swimsuits right away.
Yeah. And it was 1970. So like,
Well, and what was significant about 1970 was two things. One, I'd been at the first Earth Day on the Princeton campus, and that was pretty moving. And two, I'd been an activist at my prep school and helped organize, I think it was related to the bombing of Cambodia. We invited speakers to come over from Princeton. I remember calling the president of Princeton to see if he could come speak to us. So that wasn't my first activism. I think that was in kindergarten. But so, yeah, both the environment and activism were prominent in 1970.
Yeah. And then New College, I guess, was a receptive environment for you with that kind of orientation towards activism. And then what was your experience like while you were there?
Well, in terms of activism, I ended up on the student government. At one point, I was even a voting member of the faculty by reason of the fact that the students had a position that voted with the faculty. So yeah, I was active with student government. I was heavily involved with Kingsley Hall. I don't know if you've heard about that, but that was one semester term. We emptied First Court, and instead of people having like a roommate, we reallocated all the space so that some rooms were libraries and some rooms were sleeping rooms and some rooms were study rooms. And so it was sort of a deliberate community
Wow.
created First Court that people signed up for.
What was the name again?
Kingsley Hall.
Kingsley Hall. That's
Mhm.
good. That might be a new thing for us to explore, memories of Kingsley Hall.
Yeah.
Because like the Lorax Rebellion has been a nice sort of flashbulb moment for people who were around for it. Grant was an eyeball witness from Bob Knox. Was
From
it
the doorway of it.
Japanese? The Japanese novel? Is
It was
that
Japanese novel. It was not a Japanese postmodern. It was not part of the novel.
right? Right. But that sounds really interesting. And also the design of the pay dorms is something that I think a lot of us kind of have as part of the imprint of New College, which is why being a little experimental about that space and how it was used. That sounds pretty interesting. And I guess it was a time when intentional communities and like the way people were thinking about how to organize was more up in the air. People were more
Right.
experimental,
Right.
exploratory around all that. One of the things we all experienced, I think, is some passage at New College. You know, you meet your wife and you kind of find a way to kind of express this activist track. And it does sound like there was a connection even to that John Morrill class, and that, you know, Earth Day was the other thing you mentioned here, but there has been really this environmental thread that has really kind of run through the entirety of your life. Can you share a little more of that?
Well, yeah, that's true. I grew up with a father who was a hunter, but he was also a naturalist and a fossil finder and arrowhead collector. And
Mm,
so, well, I would say most weekends from about age 5 to age 13 or 14, my father and I would go somewhere in the state of New Jersey on some adventure looking for carnivorous plants or fluorescent minerals or whatever. So yeah, I've been
yeah.
very, very involved with the environment from an early age.
Yeah. And I hear New Jersey and you perfect together. That's a shout out for all of our New Jersey listeners. Shout out to Tom Kane, governor of New
Garden
Jersey.
State.
I'm just riffing here, Jono. This is part of what keeps people listening. You know?
I call on my New Jersey heritage frequently. People threaten me or try to shoulder me around. I said, "Hey, I'm from New Jersey. Do whatever you want."
And Central Jersey, I mean, around Princeton is actually, it's quite nice. It's called the Garden State for a reason. Like there is a nice sort of ecology, I guess, to the place. Very different
There is
than Florida.
a lot of natural diversity in the state, from
Mhm.
everything from the Appalachian Trail to the Barrier Islands. So
Right.
and what's interesting is the pine barrens. And if you were to take some palmettos or cabbage palms and stick them on the pine barrens and roll tape, no one would know you weren't in Florida.
Right.
It's a stunted pines with a white sandy soil, high water table, black water rivers. It's in fact, there's a frog, the pine barrens tree frog. It's only found in the pine barrens in New Jersey, a spot in North Carolina, and the panhandle of Florida. So
Hmm.
there are a lot of affinities there.
Yeah. But then 54 years now in this Southwest Florida ecosystem, New College is beautiful for those of us who love it. You know, like in addition to the pay dorms and the kind of architectural components, the buildings, the Ringling Brothers footprint and all
Mhm.
those things. It's also just the natural vegetation and, you know, Bayshore and other parts of the campus that I think really is part of what I really grew to love, especially as you're kind of living there. You're someone who's still in the neighborhood and has really been pursuing sort of environmental justice really over that whole time. Any thoughts on, you know, your new home of the last 54 years?
Well, yeah, it is my home, and I'm very bonded or attached to it. And people say, "Well, would you consider leaving?" And I think the answer is no. We'll go down with the ship, whether it's rising sea level or whatever.
Yeah. And for
Uh,
those of you who are listening, I think that we're also available on video, but for those of you who are listening, John is recording this from his great room, which is truly great. that's a pretty impressive Florida kind of backdrop. And then outside of that backdrop, you have actual Florida. And then one of the topics that we've been talking about lately is the trees. And, they are becoming current events in addition to part of the history and lore of the college.
If you like the trees in New College, you should hurry on down here because there are fewer every month. They're putting in a new greenhouse, and I showed the president an animation depicting the solar sun angles for various dates of the year, and showed him how these oak trees that we deliberately planted to create a tree-lined entry to the campus.
Yeah.
Once you pass the Heiser building, they were going to grow up and shade the greenhouse. He decided he was going to put the greenhouse there anyway. And last time I drove down the campus drive, they'd cut down 3 of the oak trees so that the greenhouse would have more light. So
Yeah.
I was surprised if the other 3 go as well.
Right. Well, and you're also someone who's really been pushing President Corcoran and others on the master plan, the trustees as well, like just so that there is some sense of accountability. It was something that did come up when we were talking to Jonathan White, where he was saying at the end of the day, a lot of this just comes down to power and people asserting their power and going in with your eyes open about some of that. So rather than looking for some heroic finish, there may actually be some tragedy to the narrative at this point. But I'd love to get a little bit of your perspective. How are you kind of dealing with the day to day and
I don't want to
anything you mentioned?
obsess too much about the day-to-day details if this is a timeless footage we're shooting. But, I was ready in mid-January. They announced that there would be this hearing on the new campus plan held on January 22nd. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to get this document and I'm going to take it apart, put it back together, critique each section, come out with a document people can review. And, now basically June and we still don't have the document. So,
Right. But actions are happening on campus, right? So,
yeah, a lot. And they're explicitly contrary to the campus master plan, and no one seems to feel like they're empowered to do anything about it.
right. And that there is the ludicrous number of 75,000 square feet for the Freedom Institute, which is also part of a plan. It may not be a master plan, and we're not really sure,
Yeah.
where that is going, but a lot of the Uplands area that has been really the focal point of some of the recent activity is also where this immense institute is supposed to be built.
I think it would, look perhaps a little large for a airline terminal in some major city.
Right. And this is from a guy who's sitting in a great room. Still absurdly big to talk about that much square footage. And then also, like, I don't think I'm alone in that a lot of my recollections of New College is around just being down by the bay, especially for me, like sunset, obviously, but also at night. Like, it was nice just to be down there when it was quiet.
I just want to ask Jono to describe what the Uplands is. And let me preface that by saying once on Damon, the big alum group, there was a thread about people having dreams about New College campus. And that area, that weird little zone, appeared in a lot of people's dreams, I think. Maybe I just think that because it was definitely in mine. Like recurrent dream years after, like, oh God, I'm late for class. What am I doing? I'm lost in the Uplands, or that kind of stuff. So I want to know what, like, your description of what that parcel or area.
Well, if you were to start at College Hall, the Charles Ringling Mansion, and walk north, you pass the Pritzker Marine Science Building, which wasn't here for some people, and then the old Bonsignor Psychology Building. And then once you get north of the Bonsignor parking lot, you're on a narrow strip of land between Uplands Boulevard, which runs north-south, and Sarasota Bay. It's essentially a park-like setting, or I should say was, because a lot of the trees have been removed in the last week, but essentially park-like with mature pines, particularly mature cabbage palms, a few oaks, generally continuous mangrove shoreline, although not a dense or thick mangrove shoreline. And then you come to this creek, and there's a little footbridge across it, and it's kind of mysterious and overgrown. And then that continues up all the way to the Crosley property, which was another bayfront estate, and that's now managed by Manatee County, and that other property is part of USF Sarasota Manatee. So it's this relatively narrow finger of land that extends north from the campus along the bay.
Yeah. So a bit of an isthmus if you count
Yeah.
Uplands as like a river on the other side. It's a rather narrow
Right.
strip, narrow
Yep.
tract of land. But
One of the
then
dreamlike things about it was I recall being there and the mist coming in April with a fog off the bay
Right.
and the horseshoe crabs coming up between the mangroves onto the grass. I
Yeah.
guess for breeding purposes. I don't know why they'd be leaving the water otherwise, but
There's a great story, John Morrell story about that. He had a student who went on to become probably the most famous New College graduate in the field of ecology, Deborah Rabinowitz. She wrote a famous essay on the 7 types of rarity. She died, unfortunately, but while she was a student, John Morrell had her, or I don't know who came up with it, whether it was John or Deborah, but the idea was to plant a grid of mangrove seedlings going in a gradient from deep water up onto the shore, and then so maybe 100 mangrove seedlings in a grid. She was documenting how well they grew depending on the depth of the water.
Yeah.
Collecting great data until the horseshoe crabs decided to mate and bulldozed every single one of them over, losing all the data.
horseshoe crabs are certainly a singular type of intelligence. Yeah. They seem almost like an alien intelligence. Should I segue you in that way, Megan? Welcome to the show.
Hi. Hey, Jono. Nice to meet you in person. I once smuggled a horseshoe crab from Florida to Spain in my luggage and didn't get caught. So
Wow.
a dried one.
Okay.
Okay.
I was relieved.
Because I was going to say
You would have been
decent-
caught if it had been alive.
Exactly. I would hope so.
Yeah, they're cool.
Yeah.
They milk them for some cancer drug, don't they?
Yeah,
At
They
their
need
tail?
their blood, for some sort of analysis.
Wow.
They have
Yeah.
to-
So we were just talking about the uplands, and
Mhm.
Jono was describing that space to us as we were kind of jumping
Mhm.
around his
I think
timeline.
Christian and I had one of our first dates in our experiences together in the uplands, just wandering off into that, playing in the tide pools. And
Yeah.
it was, I think a lot of us didn't go up there during our time as much.
It was kind of magical. That's why I think we probably do have dreamlike memories of it, because like it's not the type of place you would go to a lot, but when you discover it, I remember even that like bridge, that small bridge there, just felt like otherworldly. You know,
Yeah. It was very natural. It was like natural Florida, which you don't get all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why we were reminiscing a bit about some of the places. And Jono, I think rightly was saying, enjoy it while you have it, because a lot of it is actually under attack right now. Anything else really from your perspective, Jono, more like maybe with the full span of time, you know, right now we're in the thick of it. Who knows where this goes, but any thoughts on like what you've observed and
Well,
you're kind of coming to terms with it?
one thing that occurred to me, I think you had a previous podcast about the Larex Rebellion, and you may recall in the wake of that, students planted a lot of trees between US 41 and the pay dorms. But there have been other occasions. There was an event, and I'm not going to be able to place it in time, but there was a correctional facility up in Manatee County at Port Manatee, and they had been training their inmates how to do horticulture so they would have a marketable skill when they were released. And I guess some local nurserymen complained that they were competing against unpaid labor. So the edict came down that all the native plants that they'd been growing had to be liquidated and they would be given free to any nonprofit. Students got wind of that and went up with a peta truck from Buildings and Grounds and pulled back dozens and dozens, maybe 100 or more pine trees, which they planted some at Caples and some more or less south of, the first Heiser Science Building. And, even if only 5 or 10% of them survived, it was still a lot of trees. So there's a whole cohort of pine trees on campus those were planted by students. And then we have the food forest now at Caples. So I think a case could be made that over the decades, students have planted more trees on campus than the administration. They tend to, put a row of palm trees in here and then not much of anything else anywhere.
I would believe
The
that.
students have really had a major role in the landscaping.
Yeah. And then you mentioned activism earlier, and you're someone who's remained active in terms of engaging around Sarasota and what's happening at New College. There is an element of at least accountability and transparency that is probably a mode of activism that would be useful in this context. It does seem like that's something, those of you who are down in Sarasota are kind of providing that service, to the school and to our history of it. But how are you thinking about kind of engaging with the school as we're going through these troubles?
Well, we've lacked the transparency, or as I've prone to say, it's so transparent you can't see anything.
Hmm.
There's no longer a campus landscape committee. There's not a campus development committee. There's not a campus master plan committee. All the trees they're removing now are being done according to some secret plan that the administration has supplied to tree mercenaries. But you can't go online and see a map of where they're going to take the trees out.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's completely different, and we're losing a lot of trees this week.
Yeah. And then the whole concept of like tree mercenaries and kind of the way you're thinking of almost the tactics of protecting trees and kind of defending turf, like that might
Yes,
be.
but I don't think any of the students, what was it, 47 students that were arrested in connection with the airport expansion,
Mhm.
I don't think any of them were trespassed. I don't think any of them were forced to leave the college.
No,
Right.
So
they
it's a
weren't.
whole new regime here. And I have to be careful. Because of my knowledge about the campus, I can't be in a position where I get trespassed.
Right.
Because I need to have access to the campus in order to tell people what's going on. And also, I do provide information to the president. He just listens to such a small percentage of it that
Right.
you have to wonder if it's worth it. So yeah, now if students were to chain themselves to the trees, they'd all be thrown out.
Right.
So it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. And it's summer before a fall semester when the
Well,
predominance of students are
it's
going to
not
be.
only summer, we don't know if it was coincidental or strategic, but when I call people in Tallahassee to try and get help, they say, well, this is really a holiday week. And because of Memorial Day, a lot of people in our office, our attorneys are gone right now. So we
Right.
can't.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, things get sleepy in the summer, and
Yeah.
then they do want to kind of like turn the page, I guess, is the other thing that does seem evident in terms of bringing in a different type of student body. And the last couple years, there's been an increased number of new students who are kind of being brought in through the new admissions department. So like there is an element of change that is inevitable, and then some sort of ham-fisted territoriality that's kind of coinciding with that. Like none of that seems, it's sad, but it's not perhaps too surprising. But then there will be another day, and then I think that's sort of the Jonathan White, who was just on, has led a career in public service dealing in crisis management. And he was basically saying, like, what do you do the day after the apocalypse? Like, what do you do to kind of like help people, when they're in trauma or when the thing has just hit? And that's where for you, I imagine having been there 54 years, there's some wisdom that you've accrued in terms of just navigating this, and then if there's anything you could share with us or with our listeners really around like how to get through this and
Yeah.
what to be prepared for.
Well, the school has been through a lot of crises. The reason we merged with USF was we couldn't make payroll. And so, yeah, we've had our share of changes, part of USF separating from USF. So there's that perspective. A number of us, when we're, try to think about what is a likely scenario where we could get back towards what we were, and it's not clear what that path looks like. It probably would involve a different governor.
Mhm.
It's strange because for many years we had the support of local Republicans. We haven't had a Republican serve on our county commission since 1970.
Mhm.
So in the meantime, there's been lots of support for New College. It's just when DeSantis told people they needed to stop liking us, they fell into line.
Right.
The Uplands
biggest.
itself was a bequest from a Republican senator, is my
Right.
understanding. Bob
Yeah,
Johnson?
well, I don't know about a Republican senator. Are you thinking of Bob Johnson?
Yeah.
No, I think the story I heard, and again, you could corroborate this. The story I heard is that the people that developed the Uplands neighborhood, the subdivision, either gifted it to the college or sold it to the county at a bargain rate with a proviso that it remain open for the neighborhood. And we haven't seen the language on that, but somebody's working on contacting the daughter of one of the original developers to see if there's either a written record or an oral history related to that gift or sale.
Yeah.
They can't be happy about the Freedom Institute, the plans to build this massive structure on that property. That
We
But right
touched on
now,
that
what's
in
going
brief-
on is it's being cleared for a soccer field. And of course, the soccer field could be supplanted by a Freedom Institute, but
Mhm.
there's probably money for a soccer field and there's probably not money for a Freedom Institute. So I guess I'll start
Yeah.
with a soccer field.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, it does feel a little bit like astroturfing everywhere so that it's now theirs, like once they've covered all the original
Mhm.
land.
That goes in line with it's the paint over the murals and get
Mhm.
rid of the four winds. Yeah.
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 And that's something, we have talked about that where top down erasure of a culture is not necessarily
Right. Well,
something that happens.
When
you
I
know?
spoke at the alternative graduation, I featured student agency. I mean, the students really should be allowed to decide what their mascot is, and they should be able to decide what restroom is appropriate to them. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, they're really cutting into student agency.
Yeah.
I've actually heard from the ground that some of the new athletes are not necessarily into the fields being built by
Yeah. I mean, if
mowing down the
because
upland.
even I
Mhm.
imagine if you're, Gen Z soccer player who is coming to new college, you don't want to be
Yeah.
kind of playing on a field that's offensive to people in the neighborhood, depending on your sensibility. But I imagine there is a sensibility out there where oh, that kind of sucks.
I
Well,
mean, there's just a history of students loving that area and the ritual of going and watching the sunset there. No one's going to want it destroyed,
Right. It is interesting, I guess, also in that there's a potential to kind of reposition the historical New College as a real asset to the actual community down there, and how the current administration probably will not be doing that good a job of community engagement. So there is a potential, I think, at least on a local level, that there's probably more support for at least protecting the natural habitats there.
Well, like I said, this is primarily park light. There was a mangrove fringe and there was the vegetation along the creek. It was basically a park. But what I've been emphasizing, most of that land up almost to the creek was owned by the Ringlings at one point. This town is really serious about the circus, about Ringlings, about history, about
Yeah.
architecture. So I've been telling people, forget New College, just take New College out of the equation.
Yeah.
This is part of a National Register historic district.
Mm.
And this is important to our tourism, our identity as a community.
Mm.
And why are you doing this?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's great. Yeah. And then I know you gave Grant a really interesting list that we could potentially do a lightning round rundown with you, Jono, if you
All right.
have any stories you wanted to
I can
share.
give you one sentence on
Yeah.
each of those that I
Yeah.
remember.
So Grant, have you ready to roll? Yeah.
The University Press of Florida.
Okay, the University Press of Florida would list all the members, all the universities in Florida in the front of each book. And then for years, even after we were part of the university system, they would never list New College. And I finally called that to attention. And they added Uzi Baram. And now if you pick up a University of Florida Press book, it lists New College.
Nice.
Okay. Megan, you want to do next?
Sure. First name index and directory.
Okay, so the college used to print a directory of all the employees so you could contact them. It was listed by last name. Well, we don't wear name tags at New College, so no one knew anyone's last name. They said, you got to call Joe over in physical plant or get in touch with Sue or whatever. So I said, could you just put a couple of pages at the end with people's first name and what department they're with? And that was tremendously helpful.
All right. Terminated Vista in Plaza.
So when we were doing the campus master plan, we were working with Will employees, Zoides, and I emphasized that when you were at College Hall and started walking up Dort Promenade, there should be something that you could see through the arch that would be the Terminated Vista. And it ended up that stainless steel sculpture that's there now.
You have a very real physical understanding of New College that I think the rest of us have a kind of higher level thing. A lot of these things became fixtures that we didn't even realize had to be made. We just kind of thought of it as part of the environment around us.
Closets in Dortstein.
Okay, so when you do architecture, you start with a program, which is not a drawing or a sketch. It's a list of what each building has to do. And then the architect takes that information to try and comply with those mandates. And so they had an advisory group on the 2 Dortstein dorms, and I was on the group. And I don't know whether we were looking at the program or if we were looking at actual sketches they'd come up with. I think it was the program. But I finally said, are these students going to have any clothes? Like, where are they supposed to keep their clothes? They had not programmed in closets in Dortstein, and then they had to go back and add closet space.
Wow. And I'm not going to make a closeting joke with the new administration. Yeah. Oh, that was the old administration anyway. Okay, got it.
Names of VWXYZ dorms?
Okay, so when we hired a firm to do new dorms beyond Dortstein, we said, we don't want one giant residence hall. If you could do some smaller buildings, that would be great. And so they came back and said, well, we came up with 5 buildings, and because they're naming opportunities where a wealthy donor could put their name on the building, we have these placeholder names, and we're calling them A, B, C, D, and E building. And I said, well, that's great, but we already have an A, B, C, D, and E building. I'm not sure this is going to work. Why don't we call them VWXYZ? And they said, okay, we'll do it. So
Nice.
Z-dorm, that's how Z-dorm got its Z.
That's awesome. Location of shorter palms in Palm Court.
Now, I don't know if this is true. We have to check. I think when we replanted the Palm Court, we didn't put palms that were all the same height. It may be shorter on the outside and taller in the center to create more of a dome effect. We could go look at that.
Get your tape measures ready. Yeah, Grant.
I remember the dead palm tree painted like a rocket.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
My cohort. Cabbage palms at Zinn's.
So when the Zinn's building came down and they wanted to landscape it, I said, why don't we put in cabbage palms? Because then if we decide to do something else interesting with that triangle, we could simply dig them up and plant them elsewhere. Whereas if we plant any other dang tree, they're just going to have to be cut down and sent to the landfill. So that's how we ended up with cabbage palms.
Alumni?
I applied to be on the Alumni Association board when it was first formed, but I was told by Bob Benedetti that an employee couldn't serve on an alumni association, which I never really understood. But eventually I was allowed to serve. And when I somehow, at some point in time, I said, well, we shouldn't be using one gender to describe our alums. We should do both. And so for many years, it was alumni. I think they've dispensed with that, but it stuck for a while.
There you go. How about identifying by entering year?
Yeah, that was another argument I made when I was on the Alumni Association board, that everybody knew the cohort they entered with, and people get on such different schedules that they don't necessarily know the cohort they graduate with. So it might be more meaningful to do it by entering year.
Yeah, and we have honored that tradition on this podcast because that's certainly the way we think about things. So thank you for your service.
Absolutely, and you don't have to explain why it's longer that way, which is nice.
I'm happy I get another tree one. Oak Salon, Dort Promenade.
So from about maybe a little beyond 4 Winds, Julie and I, and it's not clear whether it was in 84 or 86, but we suggested planting live oaks along particularly the south side. And if you go and measure, you'll see that the oaks diverge. The closer you get to, as you go down Dort, each oak is further from the promenade than the one east of it. And that was to sort of create this forced perspective effect as you approach College Hall, the expanse of the view would open faster. And those oaks are all still there for the most.
When were those planted? What, around
84
what
or
year?
86. Well, let's
Oh.
compromise and say they were planted in 85. And of
Okay.
course, some of them you can't put your arms around and have your fingers meet. I mean, they're big oak trees. If you ask
Oh.
people, they'd say, "Oh, that's a 75 or 100-year oak tree." But it was
I know. When I went back to campus, that was the thing. This was about 8 years ago. Seeing how much bigger the trees were when we were there just completely blew my mind because that ecosystem is just so tree friendly, which is good given what's going on right now. Gives me hope that when all this is over, we can start again. So campground at the reunion.
we had, was it the 50th reunion? I forget which
Yeah,
one
it
it
was,
was.
I think, the
But I
50th, yeah.
suggested that if students didn't want to have expensive hotel rooms, that we set up a campground on the soccer field, on the ball fields, and that actually happened.
I stayed in it and I loved it.
That's so
Okay.
cool.
There you go. North Trail food vendors at Signature Weekend.
Yeah, I think that was the first time we had food trucks on campus, so that was neat. I have no idea what the amnesty contest was, but I was responsible for coming up with it. I'll have to ask people, what was
Yeah. So if you're listening, there is an item in Jono's historical accomplishments that he needs some more context around. This is called the Amnesty Contest. So we'll get our crack research staff and our outreach going on that one.
Okay, the tile design on the ACE building.
So when Mullampalazoides were designing the ACE building, they thought it would be nice to have what are variously called Spanish tile or Cuban tile. And these are not ceramic tile, they're hydraulic cement. And these were made in the Dominican Republic. And they suggested a design that looks sort of like what you would have on an indoor swimming pool. They were wavy blue lines. And Paul Scudder at a meeting said, well, that's interesting, but couldn't we have something that was more New College? So I fiddled around with tessellations and a variety of different approaches, a single tile or multiple tiles, and finally came up with a pairing of two different designs that when combined made a continuous Four Winds design.
I remember that. That's brilliant.
Well, and the next one is the graphic Four Winds design.
Right. So the Four Winds design that was designed by someone at the pay shop was this very fine line, precise design with a double line. It looked great on stationery, looked great on a diploma. But once they put it on a license plate, you couldn't really, it was very vague and hard to read. And they wanted to put design on the bridge abutments and use it elsewhere. And I said, well, it needs to be more graphic. And instead of hiring someone that actually knew what they were doing, I went ahead and came up with a simplified Four Winds design that some people hated, but that's what's on the overpass abutments now. And, it's appropriate in that setting, in my opinion. Then the school had a turnover in their promotional department, and they started putting it on Nimbus and other publications where the fine line design would be much more appropriate.
So this is the big finish, people. We got 7 left.
Okay.
7 left. Bringing it home. All right.
Lightning round.
Bates Johnson dorm switch.
Okay, so they named the first, second, and third court for various people. I think Michelson has one name for him, but they ended up putting Peggy Bates' name on a dorm that she didn't live in, which would have been first court. So I brought that to people's attention, and they switched it around, and now first court is Bates Court.
It's as if they didn't even remember the Kingsley.
Yes, Hall, right.
Kingsley Hall. That's a callback. You're welcome. Okay, Grant, you're up.
Okay, more oaks. Spacing of oaks on College Drive.
This is the oaks that they're removing, some of them now for the greenhouse, but it took me quite a while to calculate an appropriate spacing so that when you're on Campus Drive and past, the old Heiser Science Center, you were going to go through these paired oaks on either side, and it took me quite a while to calculate all that out.
Yeah, and also on that front, if I heard you correctly earlier, more like landscaping tip for our listeners, don't plant oaks near where you're planning to put a greenhouse.
Yeah.
Because the oaks will provide shade.
Fran Meyer's event at Landbend.
Fran Myers was the first person that they hired, or first secretary. She was with Tommy Myers and a local realtor, Michael Saunders. And she'd sort of been forgotten. And when they had one reunion, apparently the early faculty would go out to her place on Longboat Key at the North End and have parties. And I was able to get some of those people reconnected for an event.
NCAA Prez on graduation platform.
Right. I argued that the president of the Alumni Association should be on the graduation platform, and that happened subsequently.
Mm-hmm.
Reverse dentils on plaza planters.
So they're going to have planters in Ace Plaza, and as is the tradition now, you build planters with a horizontal surface, and then you screw metal things and to prevent skateboarders from being able to skateboard along there. And I said, well, these are going to be really nasty to sit on and they look terrible. Why don't we, every so many feet, have a little indentation, a little square crenulation like you see in the top of a castle wall? And that's going to stop a skateboard wheel, but it's not going to be impossible to sit on. And so if you look at those planters, you'll see they have indented dentals.
Nice band name too. Yeah.
Twin Poincianas. Am I saying
Now,
that?
when you pass the Keating Center, the foundation building, there's a poinciana on the other side, and they were planted there and to try and bloom in synchrony with graduation, so that when people came on campus for graduation, these dramatic tropical trees would be blooming that they would drive under.
Amazing stuff. And this was in no particular order, but we're concluding here, Jono, with Hit Star mangoes.
Right. So Kit Riley was an incredibly popular student, very kind and gentle soul. Everybody liked him. He was doing work at the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico one summer, and several of them went to go investigate a river and a limestone or karst landscape. And a guy from Carleton College got swept over a waterfall, and Kit went in to save him and drowned.
Ugh.
And so they wanted to acknowledge, he loved mangoes. They wanted to acknowledge his presence. And I suggested that since he had been studying stars at Arecibo, that we could plant 10 mangoes with 5 mangoes out and 5 mangoes in, creating a star shape. And they're still there today.
Wow.
What kind of mango is it?
Oh, we have all the names. They're all grafted name varieties.
Great.
I think 4 of them died in a freeze and were replaced with other varieties. And we assumed it wasn't a great idea to replace them with the same variety. So 4 of them are a little smaller, but if you look on Google Earth, you'll see the 10 mango trees there. They're
That's
just to the northeast of the 4 winds.
Wow. That was quite a rundown, Jono. I don't know if you need to collect yourself for a moment before we wrap things up. That was quite,
Go ahead.
quite a rundown. Yeah.
Well, and it's a little, it spans a lot of different history.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing just that level of continuity of contact to the history of the college and the culture. 54 years is a long time.
We just don't know what the amnesty contest was.
We'll find that out, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Someone
All right.
out there, either someone out there or Megan or Grant will, I think, do some sleuthing around there. So I feel like,
We'll research it. We research it, but I'm a little afraid because before when we were getting ready to do this episode, I was looking up. I'll search for you in the Sarasota Herald Tribune and see what comes up, and I got dozens and dozens of articles about all the different things that you've done in Sarasota, like a whole lifetime of service, and it was kind of overwhelming, to be honest. Can you tell us maybe one victory that you had, in all those years that you really is special to you because you've fought so hard all these years?
Well, there are a lot of failures and things that didn't happen, but I've been centrally involved in most of the environmental land acquisition in the county since the 80s, I would say. And I've also been very involved in protection of the Mayaca River, and I continue, I serve on the Mayaca River Management Coordinating Council, which was created by legislation sponsored by Bob Johnson, who was such a big sponsor of New College. And Bob wrote the legislation that created this council without term limits. So I started serving in 1985, and I'm still serving.
wow.
So you either resign or die in office.
Wow. That's
I'm
kind of
currently
like the Supreme Court. Am I allowed to say that
so
still? Yeah.
I'm currently the chair, and we do a lot of work to try and protect the Mayaca River. There are now crocodiles being sighted in the Mayaca. We now have manatees coming up as far as Mayaca State Park.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and there's far more land along the Mayaca protected than there was whenever you were here. And amount of land developed along the Mayaca is There's less land developed along the Mayaca since 1970 than land protected along the Mayaca.
Oh.
Amazing stuff. Well, Jono, it's been awesome having you with us. I don't know if you have any final parting shots. We'd love to have you back. I feel like we just barely scratched the surface when you talk about how much stuff you've connected to over the years, but it was amazing having you this first time. And are there any final thoughts, concluding words from you as we wrap up here?
New College for me is three different things. There's the program, which is worth fighting about, how we teach, and the class size, and ISPs, and the thesis. And then there's the people, and they can't take that away. As alums, we're always going to be New College. And then there's the place, and I've probably specialized working more on the place than some other people. And it's at this point, it's a burden because it's under attack every week, but we'll keep at it.
You're like our Superman. I have a friend, Jeannie Perales, who I think you know.
I love Jeannie Perales.
Jeannie, I wrote to her when all of this started happening, and she said, contact Jono. He's the one. He'll save you. And I thought, I don't know this time. I'm not so sure.
That's the burden right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're the one.
Yeah. But thank you for your service. Thanks for appearing on the show, but also outside of that, thank you for everything you've done for the college, everything you're continuing to do. And hopefully you do feel the deep appreciation that we all have for the work you've been doing. And if there's anything you need us to do to give you the energy to keep getting back into the fight, because I know that can be particularly hard, let us know.
Well, I would say in addition to the Nova Collegiate Alliance, people should sign up for NCF Freedom. It doesn't cost anything. We have great material published online, and we're keep raising money for a variety of legal battles, and we're working on a new one right now.
Yeah, and we'll include links to that in the show notes for the episode. Jono, thank you so much for joining us on today's show.
Thank you so much, John.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. Keep listening. Let us know who else should be on. Hopefully you're enjoying what you're hearing. Spread the word. It's the Palm Court Podcast.